thank you all for coming out this afternoon. My name is Ryan, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about carbon capture technologies and how these tools can be used to both mitigate environmental damage and contribute to our path to net zero emissions over the next several decades. So first, I want to go over a brief event flow for the next hour or so is going to go. First, I'm going to give a little bit of background on the role of carbon capture technology in cryosphere preservation, as well as its importance. From there, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the current issues with carbon capture technology, sustainability problems, technical problems, as well as carbon capture's use in greenwashing campaigns in a lot of fossil fuel corporations. Then from there, we're going to talk a little bit about some promising new directions for carbon capture technology based on some cutting-edge research. And finally, we're going to talk about using carbon capture while still holding greenwashing entities responsible and effectively using this tech responsibly. And then from there, we're going to have a short Q&A at the end for any questions that you all may have. So first, a little bit about me. My name is Ryan O'Hara. I'm an undergraduate from the United States of America. My current work is in the kind of carbon capture and environmental remediation fields. I recently started a startup, Apsys Robotics, which is really focused around kind of creating sustainable, environmentally friendly direct air capture technology. And I'm officially out here as a representative of the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists, or APEX. And APEX is an organization, a nonprofit NGO, that is predominantly focused around giving early career polar and environmental scientists the chance to interact with policy and similar issues kind of in professional settings like COP27. I've been immersed in this field for the past several years, with some of my kind of key projects having been done through NASA, where I did a lot of work with kind of environmental engineering and remediation technologies for like water purification. As well as some work with the IPCC, where I was involved with the recent 6th assessment reports that came out last year. So I want to start by kind of directing our story to a region that hopefully all of us are a little bit familiar with, which is the cryosphere. So you'll see up here a graph from the IPCC's recent special report on the ocean and cryosphere, which kind of talks about kind of current and projected permafrost levels. Permafrost melting is a very severe issue with climate change. Literally every IPCC projection, from the goal of stopping our warming at about 1.5 degrees Celsius, all the way down to the more extreme 3 to 4 degree warming situations, do have a pretty significant amount of cryosphere permafrost melting occurring. And this is a problem for a lot of different reasons. Most notably the fact that the cryospheres are one of the largest carbon sinks on the planet. The World Meteorological Association estimates that the cryospheres hold a combined 1,500 gigatons of carbon at any one time. And for reference, this is over twice as much carbon as is in the entirety of the Earth's atmosphere right now. So you have a lot of carbon kind of baked into this permafrost, and as climate change progresses, permafrost ice is melting, releasing this carbon up into the atmosphere, which further fuels the greenhouse effect and global warming. And even at a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway, we're still going to see an estimated 150 to 200 gigatons of CO2 released by 2100, with the other fairly likely pathway of 2 degrees Celsius of warming, putting us at about 250 to 300 gigatons of CO2 released by 2100. And to give you a reference point, the 2-degree pathway is approximately equivalent to all the emissions that are expected to be released by the entirety of the European Union over the next 80 years. So this is a massive amount of CO2 that's getting removed from the permafrost at a daily rate due to climate change. And it's also worth noting that kind of as the permafrost continues to melt and we have more CO2 being emitted into the atmosphere, this feeds into positive feedback loops that only continue to fuel and speed up the rate of climate change and planetary warming. So there's been a lot of debates over potential ways to address this problem. We'll talk more about some of the kind of social ones later on in this presentation. But one of the more promising technical solutions is the concept of carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS. And CCS tech comes in two primary categories. We have direct air capture and point source capture, which you can kind of see modeled up here on the diagram in green and red arrows respectively. And both function more or less the same. Your emissions kind of come through some kind of CCS unit, which extracts CO2 from the atmosphere, or your emissions in the case of point source capture, and releases slightly more purified carbon dioxide blocking air while sequestering the CO2 itself away. And this process does require a fairly significant energy inputs, which will be important later on. And this presentation in particular is going to focus on direct air capture, but many of the points I'm going to bring up and address are relevant to point source capture as well. So there's a lot of motivations for why we need to invest in direct air capture as a kind of burgeoning, promising technology. And one of the keywords is best modeled with this graph up here from a Nature paper about 10 years ago. And this graph kind of really showcases the fact that carbon dioxide has a very, very long atmospheric lifespan. Even on the short ends, you see carbon dioxide emissions kind of remaining in the atmosphere for 300 to 400 years, after which about 25% of all emissions will then remain in the atmosphere for thousands of years afterwards. So carbon dioxide does not go away. Our emissions will matter generations and generations down the line. And we could stop all carbon emissions today, right now, and still have a fairly significant amount of warming baked into the Earth system due to kind of recent carbon emissions and carbon emissions that are expected to last and maintain themselves in the atmosphere for a very long period of time. This paper, for instance, discussed the fact that assuming all warming were stopped today, we still have about 50% chance of surpassing the 1.5 degrees Celsius benchmark over the next decade or two. So we need some kind of technology or some kind of solution that can remove some of this built up CO2 in the atmosphere, right? You know, to maintain a 1.5 and 2 degree benchmarks, we need some kind of solution. And direct air capture is one of the only real, even remotely feasible ones that's being suggested up to this point. And direct air capture is not the only, I suppose, potential source of removing CO2 emissions from the atmosphere. Direct air capture is actually based on a lot of natural processes that are performed by trees and algae and other synthetic organisms. Kind of when performing photosynthesis, a lot of these organisms will pull CO2 from the atmosphere to fuel all of their life's processes. But unfortunately, we can't rely solely on trees and related vegetation to remove all this excess CO2 in the atmosphere. It's a predominantly a land use issue. There's been a lot of studies done on the fact that we do have a kind of peak on the amount of trees that we can plant at any one time. And even today, all the world's forests only account for approximately 8 gigatons of CO2 released per year, in comparison to the 36 gigatons that human civilization released back in 2021. So it's a very important buffer on our CO2 emissions, but it does not address all of our emissions. And the hope is that direct air capture and related scale carbon capture technology can work alongside trees and algae in sequestering more of our CO2 emissions every year, and effectively buying us more time in implementing long-term, permanent political and social solutions to the climate crisis. So up here I have a model of Climeworks, who's probably the global or one of the global leaders in carbon capture at the moment, on how their technology works. And there's a lot going on, but kind of the general sequence is that air is filtered in through these large fans, effectively. And from there, a series of chemical sorbents and chemical processes are used to remove CO2 from the ambient air, release purified air back into the atmosphere, and then store the CO2 away for later treatment. And the storage process is incredibly heat and energy intensive. Which means that for any of Climeworks' large facilities to operate, they require massive electrical and fuel inputs from other sources. And this has been one of the biggest problems in kind of large-scale direct air capture implementation up to this point, is the high energy requirements. Just due to the kind of very basic laws of thermodynamics, we need a lot of energy to store away and kind of transition where CO2 exists on the planet. And unfortunately, a lot of these energy requirements tend to be solved by non-carbon neutral energy sources. We'll talk more about this later with some examples and case studies. But there's a lot of cases out there of these direct air capture facilities who utilize fossil fuels and similar non-sustainable fuel sources to run their facility. And in the best case scenario, this dramatically decreases the net amount of carbon being sequestered away by your direct air capture device. And in the worst cases, you have instances where the fossil fuels used by a direct air capture facility are either equivalent or greater than the amount of CO2 being extracted from the air, which defeats the entire purpose of the technology. Beyond that, we have a lot of pricing issues. On the less expensive end, a lot of direct air capture costs approximately $200 to $300 per ton of CO2 sequestered. And most economists agree that for this technology to be scalable and usable at any kind of wide scale, we need to drive that price down to about $100 per sequestered ton of CO2. And a lot of kind of recent technological advancements and research is getting us closer and closer to that goal, but we do still have quite a ways to go before we kind of reach that number. From there, there's also a lot of land use concerns and implementation cost problems. Most direct air capture facilities in use today are these kind of large, kind of multi-kilometer square feet facilities that cost billions of dollars and multiple years to kind of fully implement and build. And having parameters like that makes it very difficult to, again, scale any kind of technology up, especially considering that any one of these facilities doesn't really sequester as much CO2 as its price and time to build would suggest it does. So you have a major cost to put in to build these, but the output of results given by these facilities doesn't exactly match the cost. And you also have a lot of issues with the social treatment of direct air capture. And to best illustrate this point, I want to kind of give a case study from America. So up here you have a picture of the Atchafalaya National Wildlife Refuge. It's part of the wider Atchafalaya Basin region in Louisiana in America. And this is America's largest river swamp. It's home to over 200 species of birds and a kind of wide, kind of flourishing ecosystem of flora and fauna. And it's incredibly important to the just general environmental health of the Louisiana region. But unfortunately, just down the street from the refuge, quite literally, ExxonMobil built their Baton Rouge oil refinery. This is one of the largest oil refineries on the planet, 5 or 6 if I remember correctly, with a kind of refinement capacity of over 540,000 barrels of oil per day. It's a very bustling facility, a lot of activity, and a lot of refinement going on there, still to this day on a daily basis. And as I'm sure no one is surprised by, this isn't exactly an environmentally friendly process. Kind of frequent leaks in oil piping, just general harmful emissions released by this facility have led many to colloquially refer to kind of this region of Louisiana as Cancer Alley. It got its name from the fact that kind of the communities living nearby experience cancer at incidence rates of about 150% the national average, most of which has been directly connected to these harmful carcinogenic emissions being released. And it's also been formally recognized as a sacrifice zone, which means that human activity in this region of the world has permanently altered the local ecosystem for the worse. And it's going to take a very long, sustained period of no human activity there to even remotely co-kill this ecosystem back to the way it once was. And many kind of larger entities have also kind of weighed in on this specific region. The U.S. Department of the Interior, for instance, has said that conditions there are, quote, lethal to most species of wildlife, while the UN Human Rights Committee has noted the fact that because many of the communities in that area are low-income communities of color, it is basically a case study for environmental racism, where the most vulnerable among us experience the worst outcomes of climate change. And ExxonMobil and the kind of associated Louisiana Chemical Association in response formally denied all these claims and took no responsibility for the outcomes in this region. Relatedly, ExxonMobil is a huge fan of carbon capture. Their LaBarge Center up in Wyoming is one of the largest point source carbon capture facilities on the planet, sequestering approximately 6 to 7 billion tons of CO2 per year. And while it's a good case study on the potential effectiveness of this technology, it does bring one to question how can an organization and a company who spends so much money every year on climate denial and kind of funding think tanks who are pushing through kind of climate denial policies, how can they simultaneously claim to care about the environment with technology like this? And this is a great example of greenwashing, which is a term that I'm sure many of us are familiar with. But greenwashing effectively refers to the idea that you can have kind of entities, predominantly companies, who emit fossil fuels and kind of engage in environmentally harmful practices, can utilize kind of technologies or marketing to make themselves appear a lot more eco-friendly than they actually are. The unfortunate reality is that, as you see in that case study, carbon capture technology is being used as a greenwashing entity by a lot of these agents. It's been co-opted, one might say, by kind of a lot of these companies. To talk a little more about greenwashing, TerraChoice released a 7 Sins of Greenwashing, kind of describing what this process entails, and noted that about 95% of green advertised consumer products are guilty of at least one of these sins. This is a very, very widespread issue among the kind of private sphere, particularly among private entities who claim to be environmentally friendly, right? TerraChoice themselves are a pretty large environmental think tank and firm, kind of doing research on a lot of this stuff, and this has been backed up by some other sources as well. But they are not alone. A lot of greenwashing also occurs in the public sector by governments, and a good example of this can again be seen coming out of the US back in 2003 with the Clean Air Act. And the Clean Air Act was pushed through by the Bush administration and basically claimed that by introducing some new caps on CO2 emissions, we'd be able to have kind of healthier skies above America. But as studies have shown in the last 20 years, this act actually resulted in weaker emission controls on literally every other non-CO2 emission and gave a lot of companies additional loopholes to kind of bypass a lot of EPA environmental restrictions, preventing them from polluting. And ultimately, as of 2020, has resulted in 34 billion tons of excess sulfur dioxide and 8 billion tons of excess nitrogen oxide in the atmosphere. Both of these are well-studied harmful pollutants that have been tied to a whole myriad of increased mortality rates, lower quality of life, and all of it came out of a supposedly Green Act being brought through. And carbon capture, like I mentioned, is kind of just the latest tool being used by a lot of these companies as a greenwashing entity. A good example of this could also be seen via Shell, who recently built a direct air capture up in northern Canada. But some recent studies in investigative journalism by CNBC revealed that the kind of fossil fuels used to power this facility emit more CO2 into the atmosphere than the facility itself extracts from the atmosphere. It's approximately 48% efficient, which makes it very clear that many of these entities are investing money in technologies like technologies like direct air capture to make themselves seem far, far more environmentally friendly than they are, and give off the veneer of, they're supporting the environment and trying to, remove the sins of the past, so to speak. And if direct air capture is to move forward as a solution in the environment, we have to decouple it from its use in greenwashing. Allowing campaigns like this to go on greatly devalues the kind of carbon capture and direct air capture movements. It's led many to, in many cases, understandably, write direct air capture off as kind of a scam being pushed through by fossil fuel companies because of its use in campaigns like this. So I want to kind of propose 3 main topics that the kind of direct air capture and carbon capture field as a whole has to really focus on going forward in order to be an effective tool to use against climate change and to kind of sustain our cryosphere and natural ecosystem. The first of these is that we have to pitch carbon capture realistically. You have a lot of people who try to make carbon capture out to be this kind of catch-all panacea for all of our environmental problems, right? You see a lot of kind of public statements and press releases that herald carbon capture as a way to kind of completely rebuild our environments, kind of solve all of our environmental damage over the past 100 to 200 years. It's important that we're very honest about the fact that this isn't exactly the case with direct air capture. Up here you have a graph that was created by NPR based on the recent SIC assessment reports that effectively kind of shows the potential positive benefits of direct air capture technologies. The IPCC is very vocal about the fact that carbon capture-esque solutions are necessary as part of our wider arsenal of tools against climate change. And that's kind of best showcased up here, where you kind of see the red curve is a show of our overall net emissions, with the dotted line being kind of our total net emissions if we start instituting carbon removal, which is the green curve down there. And you'll notice that carbon capture does have the potential to dramatically dramatically increase the speed at which we kind of reach a carbon neutral society. In general, again, buys us more time and gives us the ability to take more time and kind of effectively wean ourselves off of fossil fuels and introduce effective policies to prevent this from continuing on into the future. But you'll also notice that it doesn't solve all of our problems, right? Carbon capture is directly focused on decreasing CO2 concentrated up in the atmosphere. It doesn't solve environmental damage, doesn't repair rainforest ecosystems. It's a very kind of specific, valuable technology, but we cannot continue treating it as a panacea for all of our environmental problems. This kind of gives a lot of credence to the idea that direct air capture might not be a viable solution, despite the fact that the tech has been shown to work and be incredibly useful. So our messaging has to move away from the aforementioned ideas. Next, I want to talk about some promising new technologies that start to bypass some of the problems I talked about earlier. So the first is kind of my specific kind of field of work and study, which is kind of on developing direct air capture systems that are based on this process of moisture swing sorption. And moisture swing sorption, as you kind of see up here, basically uses an anion exchange resin. And these resins are capable of, when dry, pulling CO2 out of the ambient air at incredibly high efficacy levels. And when exposed to water and nothing else, a series of chemical reactions releases the CO2 from the exchange resin and into the effluent water stream. This bypasses or I suppose I should say, this changes the source of the energy used to run all these processes. Rather than kind of using external electrical or fossil fuel sources, the moisture swing sorption system here kind of utilizes phase change in water when it runs through these reactions to fuel the entire process. This makes it a much more self-contained system where the resin and water can react and perform all necessary interactions themselves without much in the way of external energy inputs. So my specific company has developed what we call the Demeter system, which is kind of basically a small, think an air conditioning unit, about a 2 square meter or 2 cubic meter, device that CO2 kind of enters into an air tunnel where it is exposed to these aforementioned anion exchange membranes. These membranes then capture the CO2 from the ambient air and store it at fairly efficient and high levels. Then from there, once the kind of membranes reach their maximum absorption capacity, the air tunnel closes and a renewable stream of water flows over the membranes, kind of releasing the CO2 from the membranes into the water stream. This water stream then travels down into an algal bioreactor, shown in green up here. Algae are a naturally photosynthetic organism and have long been shown to be an incredibly effective tool in removing CO2 from influent water streams. So we then use kind of growing algae to pull CO2 from the water and serve as a long-term sequestration unit. And Aptus in our work is very, very young. We started just earlier this year, in fact. But so far, our kind of prototype design has been incredibly effective and promising. We're seeing kind of carbon capture removal at levels that are approximately equal to the cutting-edge technology. We bypassed a lot of the kind of major roadblocks and problems that their technologies face and experience. In Bernard alone in this approach, there's been a lot of work done kind of between Arizona State University and Columbia University at Arizona State's Global Futures Laboratory on the specific moisture swing sorption chemical process. And a lot of their work has shown very similar results to what we've been seeing, that this process is far less expensive, requires next to nothing in the name of kind of external energy sources, and is much more capable of scalability than a lot of modern cutting-edge direct air capture technologies, and therefore should be a kind of major focus for the DAC field going forward. There's a lot of promise here in this field and this specific approach to direct air capture, and this institute in specific believes that moisture swing sorption should be the focus of all direct air capture going forward. And I also want to kind of give a nod to OpenAir, which is a kind of group led by Dr. Tao Wang out at Zhejiang University in China. And they have created a very similar system to the one that I have outlined, where again it uses anion exchange membranes to pull CO2 from the air, and then they kind of release it into greenhouses for use in kind of growing and harvesting plants. And again, the results have been incredibly promising and kind of echo what we've seen through our testing, as well as what previous literature has shown these pathways are capable of. So we have a lot of promising work here, but the funding going into this field doesn't exactly match the promise of these academic sources are coming out and saying that it does. As of right now, in America, the U.S. government has invested a total of $100 billion into direct air capture and associated carbon capture research and institutions. And this is dramatically less than a lot of other sources of renewable energy in related fields, which you kind of see up here in the yellow bars. That showcases the amount of dollars in millions that are invested by the government per year. And a kind of recent study done by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine indicates that if you scale up carbon capture funding from the U.S. government to about $240 billion per year, which is still far less than other kind of renewable energy and climate solution funding, you could dramatically increase the speed at which these new technologies are developed and brought out. One of the biggest reasons that carbon capture hasn't been able to really find a foothold in kind of our modern arsenal of tools against climate change is this lack of funding, right? It takes time, it takes money to develop research and kind of find new ways to scale new products and pathways forward. And by investing more money kind of from the government into research institutions and entities kind of doing work on these more environmentally friendly methods of direct air capture and carbon capture, we'll hopefully see a pretty major boom in the speed at which this technology can develop and come out. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about how we can kind of pair carbon capture with decreases in emissions and just generally sustainable practices. Like I talked about earlier, there are two important things to remember about carbon capture today. One, it is not a catch-all solution to all of our environmental problems, right? It's very specific, focused, and needs to be treated as such. And two, it has a kind of major role in greenwashing campaigns. It needs to be separated from the concept of greenwashing if it is to be fully accepted by environmental circles and society as a whole. So, in general, as carbon capture continues to be developed and scaled up, we have to see a simultaneous ramping down of fossil fuels. These two processes have to be paired together. They cannot be done separately or disconnected. So for that, I have kind of just three potential policy solutions that could help us pair these two ideas together. The first of which is kind of a process of accountability, right? We need to not allow the carbon capture field to be dominated by fossil fuel agents and entities, because that makes it very easy for groups like Shell, as we talked about earlier, to create their net positive carbon emission direct air capture plants that don't do much of anything to solve the climate crisis. By kind of moving this technology out into research universities and kind of third-party companies not involved in the kind of energy sector, you introduce an element of accountability where the energy company is not responsible for monitoring both their own emissions as well as what's being pulled in. A second potential pathway is kind of introducing financial incentives at the national and local government levels. Potential processes like tax breaks, rebates, and similar private entity financial compensation that's kind of used today in other fields can be introduced in the direct air capture field as well. For instance, fossil fuel companies that purchase CCS technology from other entities can have some tax breaks. It's kind of an incentive for them to take on and adopt this technology. And you can also kind of use this as a means to push a lot of these fossil fuel companies to create actionable, sustainable plans to wind down their usage of fossil fuels. Again, perhaps a fossil fuel company that can kind of show that it's slowly winding down its environmental damage on a year-by-year basis can experience some major financial gains from the government. And in general, we should just continue investing in kind of clean, sustainable energies, right? It's related to carbon capture, but carbon capture does not act alone. If we do not invest in these kind of related sustainable energy fields, we're never going to decrease our dependence on fossil fuels and slowly move away to a much more sustainable, green world and environment. And I want to use this as kind of a move into a call to action that we've probably heard quite a bit while here at COP27. but it's the fact that we are kind of at a very dangerous crossroads right now. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us read the UN emissions program report that just came out the week before this conference, which effectively talked about the fact that there's really no viable, realistic path to stop our warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? It looks like we're going to shoot right past that toward 2 degrees. And, I'm, very young myself, in my early 20s, and, kind of seeing the future that the kind of world holds for my generation and those like me, it's not overly promising. And, we're at a kind of very serious, important point in the climate crisis right now. And one of the biggest problems we've seen is that our world is still hopelessly dependent on fossil fuels and has no real way forward. And direct air capture does introduce a potential pathway to buy us more time to slowly wean ourselves off fossil fuels into more sustainable energies. It's the only real kind of geoengineering / technical solution put out there that has the potential and is realistic enough to kind of, again, buy us the time and work the levels that we need it to give us the ability to introduce policies over the next 10, 20, 30 years to go carbon neutral and hopefully move past the climate crisis into a cleaner, greener world. In general, the future we build is the future we get. No one's going to come save us and solve this problem. And investing in these technologies is a very important first step in doing so. The more money that goes into direct air capture and similar fields will kind of drive faster innovation in this field and in generally give us the ability to produce better, more effective technologies to, again, give us the time we need to move past fossil fuels into a more sustainable world. So with that, I want to thank you all so much for coming. Hope you learned something, got some value out of this talk. I would like to encourage you to reach out to me if this is a field that interests you and you want to talk more about it. I have my email up here, as well as a QR code to my LinkedIn page. So I encourage you to, check it out and, let me know if you want to talk more about this. So from here, we're going to move into a short Q&A. If anyone has any questions, I'll take them now.
Hello. Nice presentation and quite interesting what you're trying to do. My question is, have you thought about the upscaling process from your prototypes or your designs you got? What would be the appropriate method to upscale this into let's say, an ideal setting for solving some pollution problem?
Yeah, no, really good question. I'll kind of bring us back to the diagram from earlier, which is that we've effectively tried to create a device that is inherently scalable and kind of easy to mass produce. We are pretty much the smallest carbon capture device out there, to the best of my knowledge, kind of running about 2 cubic meters, which is about the size of an air conditioning unit. And kind of on a scalability side, because we've driven the price down pretty substantially, we haven't yet reached a point where we've done substantial financial analysis on where exactly we're at. The most related research in this field indicates that tech that runs the way that we run it and is about as efficient as our tests have shown that it is getting very, very close, if not dropping below that $100 per ton of sequestered CO2 that I mentioned earlier is necessary for this to be a scalable and economically feasible technology. So because we've driven the price down pretty substantially with these kind of more biological-based processes that don't require as much in the way of external inputs, as well as created a kind of much smaller device that can be much easily mass-produced in like a factory setting, for instance. We think kind of those two pathways in particular are going to be super key to scaling up. We think that makes it a lot easier where, when given the resources and the money to do so, we're absolutely going to be able to take this technology, and mass produce it at a level where it can be effective in sequestering a significant ton of yearly CO2 emissions.
Thank you for a great presentation. Really fascinating to watch how carbon capture is working right now. I just have 2 questions. First, are there any type of pollutants that come out of sort of carbon capture? For example, I imagine like if you put a carbon center or carbon capture center near like an area of like, very polluted air, like emitted air, like who knows, like I'm not really sure like like what kind of pollutants like come out. So that's my first question. And second, how do you guys decide where to put carbon capture centers around the world? Like I know for example the cryosphere, they have very stable carbon dioxide levels. Well, I mean it's increasing, but it's relatively stable compared to let's say the equator where we have a lot more variability in carbon. Does variability in carbon like is that considered when we think about where to put these centers, or does that even matter? So
No, good questions. So to address the first one about pollutants, the big benefit of kind of using much more biological systems like this versus the more kind of unnatural high heat, high pressure pathways that you kind of see in a lot of the current direct air capture systems is that you really don't have much in the way of like dangerous pollutants. The only kind of real output you have from a system like this is the algae itself, which can be taken out and used as a biofuel, as a food source. But it's a very self-contained system where all of the chemical reactions, again, it's effectively kind of water and some kind of very basic resins that really don't emit anything that would be potentially dangerous or harmful. So we think that kind of because our system's not relying on fossil fuels to run, and just it fuels itself with the kind of chemistry inside, yeah, you don't have much in the way of emissions to worry about. And on the second point, we've thought a little bit about kind of where to place them for sure. The one benefit of direct air capture is that in the grand scheme of things, CO2 is not very concentrated in the atmosphere, even at kind of your levels of, like you mentioned, kind of wide differences kind of around the equator. You still have a very small amount of CO2. Kind of in the grand scheme of things, we're talking 300, 400, 500 ppm. So we probably want to focus on urban centers in general, only because the main idea behind a device like this is like rooftop installation. Just put it up there like you would any other AC sort of unit, keep it out of the way and let it do its thing. And urban centers will naturally kind of give you the greatest surface area for installation and usage. But in theory, no, there shouldn't be any major or significant kind of concerns in the efficacy of the system if you were to install it somewhere with more of a stable atmospheric CO2.
Thanks, Ryan. Question. You mentioned that carbon capture really needs to be emphasized as not being a panacea for solving emissions, solving the climate crisis. How do you, in working in this field and developing this kind of technology, how do you also parallel that with ensuring that the world is not relying on this kind of technology and we're still driving down the use of fossil fuels?
That's a really good question. And I'll be the first to admit that I don't have all the answers to this. But I think kind of the most important first step is honestly things like this, right? It's trying to put out as clear and accurate a picture of direct air capture as possible, right? And I think the hope is that kind of other leaders in this field can do the same sort of thing with marketing their technologies and be very honest about the fact that, look, direct air capture can be incredibly valuable, it's incredibly useful in CO2 emissions specifically, but beyond that, it doesn't do much, right? So I think step one is we'll just kind of change the messaging around this field. And I suppose that's kind of an endemic problem with trying to sell a product in general, right? That was trying to make their solution out to be more impressive and more valuable than it actually is. But personally, I think kind of with something like this, where you're dealing with a global, serious, severe crisis, we kind of all have a moral imperative to portray ourselves honestly, right? And kind of be very honest about what our tech can and cannot do. So we kind of open up these niches for kind of other researchers, other companies, other entities to kind of come in and fill in that space. I kind of hope you can kind of pair that with the financial incentives that I talked about earlier, where by kind of incorporating kind of government funding into the whole game, you can hopefully kind of reach a point where I don't know, a company that say properly advertises its carbon capture device doesn't kind of fall into the greenwashing trap. Experiences some financial incentives to kind of try to get more companies and private entities on the the same page to do this sort of stuff. So yeah, largely it's kind of it's a messaging and social thing first and foremost, and kind of hopefully if you start to change the political perception and the social perception of this sort of technology, that'll kind of actually push everyone to be a lot more honest about what direct air capture can and cannot do. All right, well, if that's all the questions. I'll be hanging around here, so feel free to come talk to me. But thank you all so much for being here.
Camera? Ja? Gracias.